Hello there and welcome. Tonight, we'll take a quiet journey back in time, to the long-forgotten rhythm of life in the medieval countryside. A world without clocks, without insulation, without electric light, where nightfall arrived early, winters were long, and warmth was never guaranteed. Our story begins in the low cottages and smoky hearths of the peasant class men and women, who lived close to the soil and closest still to hardship, but even in struggle, there was routine. There was a strange kind of peace in the repetition. We'll explore how these medieval villagers endured the bitter cold, how their lives followed the turning of the seasons, and how their days were filled not with excitement, but with small rituals, survival, and moments of unexpected resilience. Then we'll turn our gaze to a life that burned brighter briefly and tragically in the biography of a royal whose winters were far different. After that, we'll uncover a strange cultural practice surrounding the medieval fear of the dark. And finally, we'll step quietly into the manor halls, where the lords and ladies passed their own frostbitten nights wrapped in furs, but often cold in ways they didn't understand. So, settle in and let history unfold around you, one quiet moment at a time. Imagine yourself in the heart of winter, in the year 1327. The fields are bare, the trees stripped of their leaves. The wind blows low and can still sound like moaning across the open land. You live in a single-room cottage with a dirt floor and a thatched roof, which leaks when it rains and sags under the snow. The cold has crept in not suddenly, first with the shortening days of autumn, then the heavy still air of early frost. Now, it is deep January, and the nights stretch longer than your firewood pile can keep up with. You and your family sleep side by side, curled on straw that smells faintly of mildew, your cloaks wrapped around you, your breath visible in the dark. The fire is little more than embers by morning. You don't have glass windows, only small slits covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. They keep out the worst of the wind, but never all of it. There are no radiators, no stoves, no flannel blankets, just a central hearth. And if you're fortunate, a chimney, though many of your neighbors simply let the smoke rise through a hole in the roof. That means coughing through long evenings, and a scent that lingers on your skin, your clothing, and your hair, the thick, clinging smell of peat smoke and damp wool. Your morning begins before the sun rises. If you're a child, your first task may be gathering more firewood, small branches, whatever's left unclaimed in the woods. Fuel is a constant concern. Forest laws prevent you from chopping down trees, so you take only what's fallen. If caught taking more, well, the penalty is steep, but you do it anyway, because you have to. Cold doesn't care for legal boundaries. If you're an adult, your work is dictated by necessity. In the winter months, there's less to do in the fields, but that doesn't mean you might repair tools, patch the roof, tend to the animals in their stables, dark, cramped spaces with the tang of manure and the low, shifting warmth of animal breath. Food is repetitive. In summer, you dreamed of bread. Now, you live on it. Coarse, dense loaves of rye or barley, baked in a communal oven if your village has one, sometimes flavored with onions, cabbage, or wild herbs. If any were dried and stored. Butter is rare, but almost unheard of. You eat what was preserved months ago, salted beyond flavor, tough and fibrous. The stew pot on the hearth is a slow-cooked blend of root vegetables, dried legumes, and anything left over from yesterday. Water is cold and sometimes unsafe, so you drink a la week, cloudy brew made from barley and boiled just enough to avoid illness. It doesn't warm you, but it helps pass the time. Evenings are quiet. There is no entertainment beyond what you make for yourselves. Some singing, stories by firelight, fables of saints and sinners, of knights and dragons. You've heard them 100 times, but the rhythm is comforting. Your clothes are layered but thin. Wool tunics, linen underclothes, if you're lucky, a fur-lined cloak. But fur is expensive, and yours is likely inherited, patched, and worn thin at the seams. Your shoes, simple leather, don't stop the chill. You line them with straw. Your feet are almost always cold. The rhythm of life is slow, but constant. Sleep comes early because candle wax is precious and lamp oil even more so. When the sun sets, the world goes dark. You climb into bed with your family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all sharing the same space for warmth. You don't undress. You don't bathe, not in winter. The thought of cold water on skin is unthinkable. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, you wake up. This is known as first sleep. It's a common medieval pattern. You sit quietly, talk softly, stoke the fire, tend to a child, then sleep again until the pale light of dawn returns. You don't dream of escape. Not really. This is life. As it was for your parents, as it will be for your children. You survive the cold nights, not with comfort, but with routine, with shared bodies, with the slow turning of time. Now, we turn our attention to a figure born not into hardship, but into expectation. Imagine yourself stepping into the cold stone corridors of Middleham Castle in northern England, sometime in the early 1480s. Outside, the Yorkshire wind whistles through the moors. Inside, Fire crackles in great hearts, casting flickering shadows on tapestries and walls that feel more fortress than home. And in one chamber, wrapped in furs, lies a boy frail, pale, and wrapped not only in blood, but in the weight of a crown he has not yet worn. His name is Edward of Middleham, the only legitimate son of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would later become King Richard III. Edward's early years were marked by privilege, but also isolation. Middleham Castle was grand, yes, but remote. Its thick walls kept out invaders, but also warmth. The cold seeped in winter and in mood. His parents, Richard and Anne Neville, loved him deeply, but their affection was tempered by politics. The boy was not just a son, he was an heir. He was born sometime around 1473, perhaps a little later. The records are unclear, but what is clear is that from his earliest days he was burdened by expectation. His mother was the daughter of Warwick the Kingmaker, his father, a powerful noble in the north. And when Richard seized the throne in 1483, young Edward was proclaimed Prince of Wales, a title traditionally given to the English heir. It should have been the beginning of a royal ascent. But Edward was unwell. Historical accounts are sparse, but those that remain suggest a boy frequently ill. Some scholars speculate he may have suffered from tuberculosis or another chronic condition that drained his strength and stunted his presence. Even during his brief public appearances, rare as they were, he seemed ghost-like, fragile. In a ceremony held at York Minster in September 1483, Edward was formally invested as Prince of Wales. It was the moment meant to solidify Richard's hold on the throne. But it was also one of the last times Edward would be seen in public. Not long after, sometime in the spring of 1484, he died, likely not even a teenager. The cause is unknown. Some say a sudden illness. Others suggest a worsening of whatever had quietly plagued him for years. There was no assassination, no intrigue, just a slow, cold and drafted one, far from the warmth of life he never fully grasped. His father, King Richard III, was reportedly devastated. According to chroniclers, he was in a frenzy of grief, his ambition shattered. He had already lost his only son. Soon he would lose his wife as well, and Richard himself would fall just 1 year later at the Battle of Bosworth Field. His death would mark the end of the Plantagenet line and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. But in the quiet space between those two losses was Edward, a boy destined to inherit a kingdom, and instead remembered only in footnotes. There is something quietly tragic in his story. Not a great war, not a scandal, just a boy born to rule who never got the chance. His childhood passed beneath heavy tapestries, in echoing corridors, and under the weight of expectation. He was swaddled not in joy, but in legacy. And perhaps that's the coldest burden of all. Now, close your eyes and picture the medieval countryside once more, but this time, not the chill of the wind or the ache of hard labor, but the quiet dread that came with true darkness. For in the minds of many medieval people, nightfall was not simply the absence of light, but the stirring of something else. They believed the dark was alive with presences, spirits, and things not meant to be named aloud. Shadows were not empty. They watched, they moved, and so, just as people prepared their homes to keep out the cold, they also performed subtle rituals to keep out the night. In the 12th and 13th centuries, especially in rural parts of Europe, the concept of night walkers was quietly accepted not just as folklore, but as a part of life. These were not quite ghosts, not quite demons. Sometimes they were seen as the spirits of the restless dead. Other times, they were living souls who wandered out of their bodies during sleep, unknowingly haunting the village while their physical forms remained in bed. To protect against these unseen visitors, people practiced small, habitual acts, often without realizing they were rituals. A piece of iron placed near the threshold, a bowl of salt left by the hearth, bread tucked into the eaves of the roof. These were offerings, or deterrents, depending on local belief. The hearth itself was sacred, not just for warmth, but for protection. As long as the fire glowed, even faintly, it was believed that spirits would keep their distance. If the fire went out completely, something else might slip in. Some households placed carved faces near the doorway, what we might now call grotesques or early gargoyles. These were not decorations, but watchers, meant to frighten off any malevolent force that passed through the dark. And then there was the witch's ladder, a curious object found in certain parts of medieval Britain and France, cords or ropes tied with feathers, bones, or bits of hair. They were sometimes used in malefic magic, but also, inversely, as protective charms. Hung near doors or tucked beneath the thatch of the roof, they were meant to catch harmful intent before it could reach the living. Children were taught not to look too long out the window at night, to not speak the names of the dead after sunset, to keep their hands beneath the blankets, lest something cold and old reach for them. Even the bells of the church had a role to play. At twilight, some villages rang a bell known as the curfew bell. While its stated purpose was to remind people to cover their hearth fires, its deeper, older role was to mark a boundary. The bell rang out to declare the village under protection, that no wandering soul, no mischievous spirit, had leave to cross into the homes of the living. And during particularly hard winters when food was scarce, tempers short, and illness rampant, the fears intensified. People whispered about winter demons and strange illnesses of the mind that visited only in January. Some say these were early descriptions of seasonal depression. Others think the fear itself may have been the sickness. Perhaps the most curious practice of all was the waking watch. In some households, especially those with livestock or a newborn child, one person would remain awake through the dead of night, not reading, not working, just watching, sitting by the fire, listening. It was believed that every home needed a conscious soul to anchor it during the vulnerable hours. Without one, the house might invite something in. What's remarkable is that these beliefs were rarely they were whispered. They were carried not in books, but in behavior, passed from mother to daughter, from elder to child. You might not have even known the purpose behind the act, only that it must be done, just in case. So tonight, as you lie still, wrapped in your modern blankets, warmed by technology, and surrounded by quiet hums of familiar devices, remember the ones who came before, who faced the dark without light, who passed their winters with hands folded in silence, who believed, perhaps rightly, that the night held its own kind of history. Let us now drift away from the humble cottages and superstition-laced hearths of the peasantry and step quietly through the tall, oak doors of a medieval manor house. Inside, the world looks entirely different. The walls are lined with tapestries depicting forests, hunts, and courtly love. The ceilings soar high above your head, crisscrossed with carved beams. Windows rare and precious are made not of clear glass but of thick, cloudy panes or stretched animal horn, dimming the winter sun. There are more rooms, more fires, and more servants. But still, the cold is never far away. Imagine yourself now as a noblewoman, or perhaps a lord, draped in velvet robes or woolen tunics, fur-lined sleeves, brushing the wooden arms of a carved chair. You sit beside a fireplace large enough to walk into, the flames licking slowly at logs stacked like miniature walls. And yet, your feet are cold. The floor beneath you, paved with stone, draws the warmth from your bones. Even the rushes scattered across it, herbs and dried reeds meant to soften your steps, do little to insulate. It is a common misconception that nobility lived in constant luxury. In truth, while their lives were far more comfortable than those of the peasantry, they were not free from the seasonal rhythms of discomfort. A noble's winter days were shaped by a strict, ceremonial rhythm. Mornings might begin late, especially in winter, with a servant drawing back thick curtains and laying out garments by the hearth. Dressing was a slow, layered affair. Linen underclothes, woolen stockings, tunics, doublets, cloaks. The wealthiest might own fur, sable, ermine, fox-stitched into collars and cuffs for both fashion and warmth. And even then, you might still shiver. Servants moved silently through the halls, tending fires, warming stones to place in beds, and bringing steaming pitchers of ale or warmed wine sweetened with honey. Meals were taken in the great hall long, leisurely affairs marked by strict seating order, dictated by rank. Stews, breads, roast meats, and spiced dishes were served, but not necessarily hot. By the time the food reached the far end of the table, it was often cool once again. Conversation was hushed during meals in more formal households, especially during Lent or religious seasons. There might be music, harps, or soft singing, but even that was muted in winter, when fewer guests traveled and spirits ran lower with the temperature. Bathing was infrequent, not only because of superstition, but also because heating large quantities of water was laborious. Instead, people scented themselves with herbs, changed linen more often, and used small cloths to freshen exposed skin. By nightfall, candles flickered across the hall, stallow for the staff, beeswax for the elite. The noble bedroom was not a private space in the modern sense, but one of formality. Larger beds were enclosed by heavy curtains, not only for privacy but for warmth. Sometimes, small braziers or pan-like containers filled with hot coals were placed beneath the bed or under chairs to keep the area tolerably warm. But again, even here, the cold pressed in. Some nobles traveled south during winter, if they had lands elsewhere. Others hosted feasts and tournaments to distract from the season. But for many, the winter months were a time of endurance, less colorful, less musical, more inward. And yet, within these chill routines, there was a rhythm, a kind of comfort. Reading by firelight, needlework by the window, quiet walks through frost-covered gardens, the gentle scrape of ice being cleared from the fountain in the courtyard, the sound of bells echoing through empty corridors. What truly separated noble life from peasant life was not warmth, but time, the freedom to endure cold without immediate survival tasks, to reflect, to write, to wait, because winter was, for all people, a time of waiting. Waiting for lambing season, waiting for the sun to rise just a little earlier, waiting for warmth to return, even for the lords and ladies in their carved wooden chairs. The winter was long, the nights longer, and the comfort found not in silk, but in routine, in familiar rituals, in the slow ticking of days. And so, As we come to the quiet end of our journey, we find ourselves once again in the hush of winter. We've walked alongside the humble and the highborn, through bitter nights and smoky mornings. We've stepped into the shoes of the exhausted, the expectant, the grieving, and the watching. And in all their lives, one thing was constant. The cold, it shaped them, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, seasonally. But as with all things in history, cold was not only hardship, it was also rhythm. It was also pause, a space between things, a time for stories to be told, memories to settle, and hopes to simmer quietly under frost. And perhaps, in our modern warmth and quiet, we to find something familiar in their endurance, a shared stillness, a recognition of how small comfort, soft blankets, gentle firelight, shared breath have always helped humans survive the longest nights. So now, as you lie still, and the world slows down around you, may the past gently settle in your mind like snowfall, soft, steady, silent. Good night, and sleep well.